And good afternoon, fathers and sorors. Julian Johnson. Welcome to this Department of Instruction presentation on the subject of reincarnation. One of the things that's quite interesting about this topic is that we know humanity in every culture, in every place, for thousands of years has speculated on what happens after quote unquote death or transition, as we would say in Rosicrucian terminology. And it's an intense subject of interest for a lot of reasons. And it is widely debated. And likely when you look at it, about half of the human population, if you take there's about 8 billion people on the planet approximately, for the most part, have a point of view that is very binary about what happens after quote unquote death, right? You either kind of go to paradise or you go to hell. Various twists on that. Purgatory gets thrown in some religious faiths. And there's another giant part of the human population that subscribe to the idea of reincarnation, of rebirth. And there are variations on that theme as well, of whether you can come back as a animal or whatever the case may be. But this has been a subject that has dominated human thought for a very long time. And what's most fascinating, very fascinating to me at least, and I think when you reflect on it, you'll see why so, is that actually of all of these various ideas, reincarnation is the only one with any scientific proof. The other ideas are basically speculations, great speculations that govern people's lives, have a great impact on the societies in which they dwell. But there is one, as this presentation will share with you, of these many speculations, the one that actually has scientific evidence. Granted, proof is something that is left up to each individual, but that has scientific evidence is reincarnation. And that's why this particular presentation we're calling the case for reincarnation. So we're going to begin, kind of get into the slides here. I'm going to, in some cases, kind of run through some of the content on some slides pretty quickly, because what I really want us to get to are a number of the 3 videos that we're going to share with you during the course of this. A lot of the information are going to be kind of top level facts that have been found through research regarding reincarnation, or historical points of view about reincarnation. And so I'll kind of get through those kind of quickly. This is, not a seminar where you take notes and et cetera, et cetera. It is, I think, more of a framing, giving a frame of reference for the conversation of the topic, and allowing us to watch these videos along with this presentation. So without us leaving beyond the 1 hour, we're going to try and get this done in this time. So anyway, that's what we're going to do. I am now going to, if I can get the technology to cooperate here, I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to look at this deck. But I'm going to double check something here before I do that. Pardon me while I just double check that the audio is on. It is. Okay, cool. So here we are. I hope everyone can see what's here. And I've got a thumbs up from Karen. That's great. So this is, again, the case for reincarnation. And so we kind of look at this, you can see is actually a topic that is, absorbed attention from ancient times. And we're just kind of looking at some of that. Pythagoras, who's obviously somebody very significant in the Rosicrucian tradition, it's called metempsychosis, which include animal lives between human lives. You had Empedocles, another Greek, who wrote about it. Plato, after visiting the Pythagorean school, is reported to have shared thoughts on it. Obviously, the Neoplatonists, Marcus Aurelius, a number of folks who are very influential also, I'd say, in the development of what we see in the Rosicrucian teachings today. The Buddha is supposed to have said that he could remember 500 previous lives. There were, in the Christian tradition, you have the Gnostics, who were believing in reincarnation, generally speaking, as well as some of the Jewish Gnostics. Some parts of Roman ideology and theology did, and in the Jewish culture, you also saw the Essenes, and Philo, who's a pretty renowned Jewish scholar, was also cited as having believed and accepted reincarnation as a fact. And I think we can also look at kind of more famously, Ben Franklin, in terms of the American side of it, at least, his tombstone reading something to the effect that here I lie, kind of, and I'm going to be kind of come back with fresh horses, do the race again. So it has not been a novel thing in the Western tradition. Obviously, in the Eastern traditions, it is more broadly viewed as what happens post this material life. So if we look around the world, the major world religions, you got basically about 1.7 billion believers: Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, all of who subscribe to, or let me say, is built into their religious teachings. I can't say what everybody subscribes to, but built into their religious teachings of reincarnation. And then in the non-Christian Western religious traditions, right, you have the Kabbalist. So anyone who studied the Kabbalah likely has come across this, even from what would seem to be quite orthodox sources in Judaism. The Druze, which is quite interesting. They're over there kind of in Lebanon, the Middle East area. And the Muslim who subscribe to it, as well as the Alawi, who are kind of more in Syria, but also kind of these are generally kind of small sects in Islam, in the Muslim world, and then Sufism, which was something that I think most of us have heard of and some more familiar with in terms of the mystical tradition of Islam. So when you kind of look at the Christian faiths, for the most part, no, it's been taken as a much more binary heaven or hell kind of thing, and maybe some purgatory in the middle for depending how we were, what tradition we were raised in within Christian traditions. So when you look at Americans, the Pew Research is kind of, Pew is a center based out of Pennsylvania that does a lot of research and very renowned research kind of institution, and their numbers would say that 1/3 of Americans believe in reincarnation, including 36% of Catholics, so quite different than Catholic teachings. 30% of those attending historically Black churches, right? We're very strong traditional views in some ways, but not necessarily. 38% of people who are not affiliated with a religious tradition. 28% of agnostics, Gnostics, not atheists, agnostics saying, gee, I don't know if there's a God or not. And 51% of people who say they have no particular religion at all. So it's not really even a far-fetched idea among Americans. Now, for again, those of us who like our mysticism with a dash of science, this really must, we'll look at some of the scientific evidence supporting reincarnation, right? So as I mentioned in previous discussions, are really a great institution who's delved deeply into this over 40 plus, almost 50 years, is University of Virginia and the Division of Perceptual Studies. And as people who are familiar with the college landscape, university landscape in America, know that UVA, as University of Virginia is very typically referred to, is one of our country's most prestigious institutions. Right? I think Thomas Jefferson, I believe, is one who helped establish it. Highly regarded. And there, at this Division of Perpetual Studies, they have basically examined over 2,500 cases of the spontaneous recall of past lives in children. And their focus on past lives and spontaneous recall in children was a way to try to provide more scientific purity, so to speak, to their research, because the children would be, particularly at the ages that we're generally that they're recalling a past life, are much too young. They haven't been in libraries. They haven't gone to school yet. They haven't had as much contact with these things that would perhaps give them information in which to base these past lives upon. So kind of, again, just looking at how to narrow down the factors that might influence a person's recall of a past life, while focusing on children, in this case, the spontaneous recall. And very often, as you'll see in some of the stuff, videos presented in this particular presentation, from people who are not believers in reincarnation, from families, generally Christian backgrounds, that that would be depicted in these videos, but that had no prior belief in anything actually were raised quite to the opposite. So they investigated over 2,500 cases. They've solved, as they use the term here, where they have found information that was adequate to identify a previous person's life. And some of the evidence is striking, where they wind up a person who was said hit over the head with a tire iron by a cousin in the garage when they got in an argument and they were drunk. Someone was drunk, and the individual who claims to the child who claims to have been that person in the former life was even born with a birthmark or an indentation in the skull. So sometimes this happens, and so they've got a small number of cases like that, but they've got forensic reports, very detailed, and they generally categorize their cases by 750 different criteria. What's present, when was it told, et cetera, et cetera. So they've got a very scientific way of going about this. It was led by Dr. Ian Stevens, who passed away about, I'm going to say 15 years ago, perhaps. Now is led by a gentleman named Dr. James Tucker, both a psychiatrist by background. And again, they're doing this work in one of America's most prestigious institutions, which means they've got to be extremely conservative in how they look at the data that they discover and come across, so that they can continue to function in those environments where there's obviously a great deal of skepticism to begin with because of cultural norms in the United States. But therefore, since the conventional belief is not in reincarnation in the United States, it takes very strong evidence, scrupulously and carefully obtained in order to pass muster with their peer group in a place like UVA, as well as in the journals that they've published in. So I want to begin, but there's nothing better than a video within this video. So I want to share with you this actually that's Matt Lauer on the screen here, for those of us who remember the Today Show when he served as one of the hosts of it. And here is a story that was presented on the Today Show, which, if you're getting this from the United States, you're likely aware, one of the most prominent kind of news programs, not hard news, but kind of feature story, 30 or 40 years in the United States, comes on in the morning, and it's quite a high visibility platform and so on. So here we go. Let's see if hopefully this all works.
NBC's Cynthia McFadden is here with a remarkable story. Cynthia, good morning.
Good morning. It's really a question as old as the ages, of course. What happens when we die? And is it possible that the dead return, reborn as others? Okay, it's a leap for many of us, maybe most Americans, but recently we met a little boy and his mother who are convinced he lived a previous life. They persuaded us to take a closer look. And while their story doesn't prove reincarnation exists, it sure does make you wonder. Meet Ryan, a 10-year-old boy from the Midwest who says he's been here before. Does this have any meaning for you now?
I'm pretty sure that's one of my wives.
Is 10-year-old Ryan a boy with an overactive imagination? Or the reincarnation of a man who died more than a half-century ago? It's a mystery that began when he was just 5.
It was scary at times because he wouldn't sleep at night. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming and crying. One night, he said, "Mom, I have something I need to tell you. I think I used to be somebody else." He started just telling me these stories about how he had lived in Hollywood.
Had you ever given much thought to this whole idea of reincarnation?
No, ma'am. I grew up in a Baptist church. That's not something that we were taught to believe in.
And so she tried to keep it a secret, worried everyone would think her son was crazy.
But when we found the picture, it changed everything.
A photo in a book about the golden age of Hollywood.
She turns to a page in the book, and it's black and white, and I say, "That's me." That's who I was.
That's me.
Yeah.
And you thought?
I just was stunned.
The picture was from the movie Night After Night, the film debut of Mae West.
Goodness, what beautiful diamonds. Goodness had nothing to do with it, dearie.
Her lines were memorable, but that unnamed extra, the man who Ryan pointed to, he was in just 2 scenes and didn't speak a single word.
This was the picture that his mom sent me.
Finally, Ryan's memories could be attached to a face, But who was he? Ryan's mother turned to this man for help, Dr. Jim Tucker, a child psychiatrist at the University of Virginia. For 50 years, researchers here have tracked 2,500 cases of children claiming past lives. And your conclusion is what?
These cases demand an explanation that we can't just write them off.
He's written about many of them in his book, Return to Life. But he says few of his cases have as many details as Ryan's.
How he had danced on Broadway and then had gone to Hollywood to work in the movies. Then he had worked for an agency, seen the world from big boats, talked about going to Paris. All of this, frankly, seemed quite unlikely to me for an extra with no lines in the movie.
Ryan also remembered he had 2 sisters, that he was married 5 times, and lived on a street with the word rock in it. He even asked his mother for True Aid, a brand of orange soda discontinued 50 years before he was born.
And it would be, my last room was grander. I want to go back to my swimming pool. When I wanted to go somewhere, I went down and saw the boys down at the bank, and they gave me the money, and I went.
Behaving like this Hollywood mogul, not like the 5-year-old child.
Exactly.
It took a Hollywood archivist to finally identify the man in that old movie. His name, Marty Martin. And just like Ryan said, he'd become a powerful Hollywood agent.
Ryan had talked about how people would change their names at the agency, and of course, the talent agency, they were changing people's names all the time.
And Martin did dance on Broadway, traveled the world, had 2 sisters, and even went to Paris with his wife. It was his 5th wife. And that street with the word rock in it, Martin lived on Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills. His daughter even confirmed he had a craving for orange soda, just like Ryan said. We found a bottle of that long-forgotten brand on eBay. Of course, a lot of people are going to say, come on, this is the parent or somebody else feeding them information.
I mean, it's just inconceivable that the parents, for some reason, had done all that. This information wasn't on the internet.
But even with the 55 specific things Ryan said that turned out to be true, one claim still bothered Dr. Tucker.
He said he didn't see why God would let you get to be 61 and then make you come back as a baby. So that looked like just an incorrect statement.
That's because Marty Martin's death certificate stated he was 59 when he died.
Since then, I've gotten information that the death certificate was actually incorrect, which would have made Marty Martin 61 when he died.
So he was just lying about his age like everybody else in Hollywood.
Or is a typo on the death certificate, or, who knows what.
Right.
Ryan was right all along.
Are you glad you've had this experience?
Yes, I am.
Does it still feel real to you now that you're 10?
I still feel like it's real, and it is kind of baiting.
A chance to let go of the past and just be a kid.
NBC Cynthia Mc.
So, that video with the experience of that young boy kind of touches on many things that people wonder about reincarnation. One is obviously, why doesn't one remember it? And when you look at, and you'll see with the subsequent ones as well, it's important those memories fade because depending on the nature of those memories, they might be traumatic and stay with one and really kind of, you carry those fears over. And you can look here at just here on the slide, a number of things that Jim Tucker and the Division of Perceptual Studies have found over looking at these 2,500 cases of theirs, right? So there's a continuous self, meaning there's a sense of, oneself that has different names one takes on. There's emotional identification with a prior life, typically. There's behaviors and skills linked to previous lives. Phobias and fears, which is very interesting. Physical markings and deformities, and there are examples of those. Personal likes and dislikes in relation to others persist. About 2/3 of children recalling past lives are male across cultures, and that may seem, well, why is that? But as you'll would know, as you look into this, you'll find about 60% of people who children who claim to have lived a past life, the previous life was ended violently. And as we all know, males are much more likely to have a violent end to their life than females or women. So you have a skewing here. Children start speaking about prior life at very young age, early as 18 months, ages 2 to 5, the main window. and the memories begin to fade by late childhood, and that seems to be pretty consistent as well. Now, people from the research, these again generalities based on the research, there's exceptions to all of it. People often reincarnate in the same locale, family, ethnic group, or race. So you'd find, in looking at other types of research along this line, people very often will reincarnate in the same kind of family grouping. The individuals that one shared in this life sometimes come back in different relationships in the successive life. So the aunt becomes the daughter, or the sister, and the mother is now the child, etc. So, but there is a tendency for these individuals to incarnate again within kind of groupings of sorts. As is noted here, high incidence of violent death among children with recall, up to 60%. Now you can imagine if one had died violently, how traumatized one would be if that memory was still fresh. So we know the Rosicrucian point of view is, it says, well, on average, the birth-rebirth cycle is 144 years on average, right? There's sometimes shorter, sometimes, I guess, longer, therefore. But there's an intervening period, and that 144. So if you live to be 70, you stay on the other side before you come back another 74 years in effect, on average. And I think you can see the practicality of basically that transition period where those memories fade and go deeper clearly into the psyche as compared to being so present, because they would so affect how we would function and perhaps be afraid of likely everything. Because if you had a number of past lives, likely about everything untoward that can happen has happened to you at one point or another. So it surely could leave one a little afraid of life in general, perhaps unduly. Globally, people predisposed is generally the same sex, and now that may be linked to the nature of the death. Again, when people are, dying violent deaths, generally they're dying younger than anticipated, and perhaps whatever they came into that life to do when they adopted a male identity, they come back to pick up kind of a little bit of the work that they came to do from the prior life. Cultural beliefs seem to affect cases such as gender changes. And now this could just be, they say, a suppression of information, because where you might have strict cultural norms that have place different values on gender, and like we know in a lot of societies where men and women are not viewed as kind of equal in society. Just like someone coming back from a different caste, perhaps as a place like India, where the caste system still likely plays as a whole, that people aren't going to share that information of, oh, I was a different caste before, or perhaps I was a woman, etc. So the families may not be as inclined to share that information when the child kind of begins speaking of it. As a note, gender change varies by culture, and gender switch influence childhood behaviors generally, and those things kind of fade with time. So interesting here, the median intermission time frame. Now, intermission is this period, it's a label I've given to this period between lives, between the transition out of this life and coming back again. And these cases, 16 to 18 months. And one might say, well, gee, that seems to be quite different than, as an example, what the Rosicrucian kind of viewpoint is of a much longer period, typically. It just as well may be a result of why the people remember so much is because it is such a short time period. So again, these impressions on the psyche that our lives leave us with begin to perhaps sort of take on less prominence over time, and when we're in between lives. But when people come back very quickly, those memories are still fresh, and perhaps therefore they come out in these kind of childhood recall of these things, and which can be again very traumatizing and difficult depending on the nature of that past life experience. Asian cases tend to be lower than the median, maybe 14 to 16 months. Western cases are longer. 35 years is the median. That median is like half of the cases below, half of the cases are longer. It's not a mean or an average, but half of the cases that they've looked at through the division of perceptual studies, they're half on one side and half on the other in terms of 35 years in Western cases. Buddhist cultures, intermission longer than 9 months, basically keeping median of 18 months to keep with their religious expectation of Buddhism, which means coming back very quickly, a Buddhist kind of view of it. And lastly, the Indian median is closer to 9 months or less, so very short. Now, again, what we don't know is that people's recall of it is what that reflects more so than being able to recall a past life, because they're more prone to recall a past life if it was a shorter interval in between. So we don't know if that's the median for all people or just the people who recall them because it was such an abbreviated period as the quote-unquote intermission period. But you find, by the way, reincarnation is believed in reincarnation all over the world. It's a grassroots phenomena. And researchers have looked at this, say 37 to 50% of sample societies have reincarnation beliefs. And the views are based on observations of post-death survival, people coming back to them and speaking to them, announcement dreams, children's statements, birthmarks, apparitions, and near-death experience, NDEs, near-death experience, etc. In tribal societies, reincarnation patterns tend to follow the same pattern as society, either matrilineal or patrilineal, so where people incarnate in terms of the grouping will follow their patrilineal or matrilineal, depending on how the society is structured. What's also interesting, you'll see this in these cases, and there's lots of peer-reviewed articles that the Division of Perceptual Studies has authored, and we can find them. Actually, if you go to their website, which I'll leave a reference at the end, you can download the published research. And this is where some of it is summative data where they've looked at, okay, across these, I think they went and did, I don't think they finished cataloging in detail the whole 2,500 cases, but they were up to 1,000+ cases, and they kind of had really picked them apart, went into the files, picked them apart, and categorized them in very minute characteristics, identifying them, and then kind of quantifying those numbers. Physical deformities related to previous life show up. Birthmarks linked to the cause of a violent death show up. And that was an example I was giving you about the person hit with a tire iron as an example. Internal diseases can carry forward. So something that someone was really struggling with might still manifest subsequently. And that where you got to figure, the mind has influence, I think, on how the body takes shape and so on. So if there's not a long interval, likely some of those mental patterns might still be persisting kind of in the psyche before time eventually kind of dissolves those things. Planned reincarnation, where people indicate before they die where they'll be born and with identified characteristics. A number of cases that people have, where they say back over here, and sure enough, they mentioned here, for instance, folks in the kind of native groups up in the Northwest, looking at surgical scars in babies born with corresponding birthmarks. So again, another one of those things, a physical sign of reincarnation. Also, in some traditions, and this is mainly in Asia, where people put marks on the body before death or shortly after. And then when a child is born with those marks, they know, oh, this is the so-and-so reincarnating. So one of the questions is, well, does the maternal impression about that kind of lead to those marks being present, but they've seen instances where the mother did not know, and the connection was identified after. Very interesting, looking at prenatal influence on the baby's body. So one obviously is looking at some diseases or getting hit in the head, but there's a wonderful account of a fisherman died when the future mother was 2 months pregnant. So there was a woman who was pregnant. This guy dies, and he was very wary of being a fisherman, and because he's out there, it's kind of not mechanized fishing, but with nets and pulling those in, etc. And so he told several people that when he was born, he did not want to have a left hand, because I guess that's what he pulled with. And his granddaughter was pregnant, and she gave birth to a child with a deformed left arm, and the child also had a fear of water. So one of those prenatal things. Another example I give is a birthmarks, an open scar corresponding to suicide, gunshot wound, entry, and exit wound. So there are other cases. These are just two that kind of shared with you here. Looking at, again, at these kind of prenatal influences affecting markers of the body. Intermission memories. So this is kind of interesting. About 20% of the children remember the intermission period, the period between lives. And what's also interesting that very often the ones who do remember have some of the best documented cases in other ways, in terms of being able to know who they were and finding, solving the case in terms of who the previous life was, et cetera. So they're typically high quality cases when measured by other criteria to verify the statements of the child. And about 20% of overall of kids have these intermission memories. But again, they're coming generally from very strong, strongly evidenced cases of recall. So they've generally kind of broken these things into 3 stages of this intermission period. The immediately after death, right? So that's when certain things are happening. Discarnate realm state, so between lives, and then the selection of parents for the next life. And there are lots of different sources that relate even to the selection of parents for the next life. So, and I think we likely heard more anecdotally of people saying, well, you choose to be here. You chose your parents. You chose where you wanted to incarnate, which usually when we're wondering, why do we choose this sometimes when that takes us aback, that statement, there's not as much information on the life in the womb or actually the birth experience. What is also interesting, though, is there pretty good correspondence between near-death experiences and what they're describing and descriptions from these intermission reports. So particularly, in that kind of immediate stage of immediately after death. So we see a bunch of things in there related to these stages and so on. One particular one that we saw in there was the picking of selecting his parents. And there's lots of stuff around this, but there's just coincidentally a wonderful, clear example of that. So they've characterized, looking at these intermission examples, of 3 stages, as was mentioned before the video. One is immediately after death. So typically it's like confusion if death is sudden, right? Death is not, generally not as much confusion. Very often, folks are hanging close to the physical body and surroundings. Aware of people mourning, even attend one's own funeral, not uncommon. We think we've likely heard that with a lot of other things over the years. And can either can be the lack of awareness or continued awareness uninterrupted into after death stage. So that likely has a lot to do with how one makes that transition. But I think this, if you look at the Rosicrucian view about reincarnation and cremation, some of that has to do with cremation of breaking down the physical body. Right, so it's very quickly broken down, obviously through cremation. Generally, in many traditions say, well, wait, 3 days or some period of time before doing that, because there's still an attachment for the consciousness and the soul personality that inhabited that body. But then to break down its physical elements to help kind of speed that transition. Knowing this, it surely can affect how we respond to the transition of an individual. I think one way of putting it is that we may miss them, but we don't have to mourn them. They're okay. The second stage is this disincarnate stage, and it's got a lot of stuff going on in it. It's quite varied. Some cases, the interaction with the material world and people still living. In Asian cases, people really move from away from the earth plane, at least this initial stage, right? Disincarnate stage. So variety of things. The beliefs apparently carrying basically beliefs they carry beliefs into the afterlife conditions. Their beliefs condition the afterlife experience that they're going to have. So depending what you go in with, what you think is very much is what you might initially experience. They say descriptions of afterlife by children don't seem dreamlike, but instead rational decision making. So that's a little bit of that. There's more information on it too. Western cases, generally the subjects tend to move on to a heaven or something comparable, looking at our religious traditions. Asian cases, subjects tend to be on the earthly plane, may use the opportunity to identify as like the new mother. Their cultural differences seem to affect the mindset and experiences of different countries, and again, religious differences, etc. and there's a different length of intermission period may affect the experiences also. So depending on how soon you come back, and where you likely, because of the relatively short durations of these people who had these past life recalls, coming back soon may just leave one more susceptible to those things, and including the trauma. And think about, we likely have all had numerous past lives, and in some cases, good to forget some of that stuff. So anyway, the last part, which just came out very nicely in the video, looks at individuals selecting their parents, right? A significant degree of agency is reported in the cases, meaning the sole personality is kind of deciding. Some cases, there's an attachment, something that pulls, like this a young boy describes. He saw these folks in Hawaii and thought, oh, he was drawn to them, right? And in many of these cases, there's a guide of some nature who helps one, and these guides usually, depending on one's religious traditions, just a plain guide, a Jesus figure, some sort of non-human spirit or relative, very often in travel cases. There are these kind of non-human spirits. They tend to be the role of gatekeeper, escort, entity in charge, and then there's others kind of very often that our personality perceives during this kind of in-between state. Different cultures, as they say in the West, entities almost always interpreted as God or Jesus. Helpers tend to be called angels or seen as angels. In Asia, there's the Yama, king of death. There are other helpers that very often contribute to these minor deities. You find similar things in different tribal cultures as well. Recollection of childbirth is rare, as noted before, but what's interesting, just one example that I thought was kind of worth citing here, is the case of a miscarried twin. Came in instead through a relative, was reborn, but through a relative. So came back in the family, nevertheless. So if we look at cases of abortion, perhaps when they're kind of thinking, I'm going to come in through this one, nope, parent decides to abort the pregnancy, then the person may look at coming in through another relative in that circle. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about past life regression or past life hypnotic regression, because some of you may be familiar with that. In this particular presentation, we focused on things that could be corroborated to a reasonable extent, and reasonably using the scientific method to do it. And that's why I basically focused on cases that were not a result of hypnosis. Past life kind of hypnotic regression is a therapeutic technique that's been very helpful for many people. There's really there's no scientific evidence, at least not able to be presented as the past life recall in children, about the validity of the reports. There's always the challenge of suggestion and suggestibility that plays into anytime we go into hypnosis and recalling things through hypnotic experiences. There are many reports are very similar to the ones that we see to the spontaneous recall of past lives in children. I will note to you, actually, there's a number of studies done in Korea, and where people were going after trying to understand this, assess the validity through a particular type of measurement, and then they have found that the suggestion, basically, presenting even a false person to a made-up person, a fictional person, to a person under hypnosis, that we were able to, just like artificial intelligence, kind of create a whole bio for the person. So there are a number of very interesting books that say there's definitely a correspondence between the accounts of kind of the spontaneous recall and what people come up with through these regression. But we in investigating this in the past, with some of our colleagues in the New York area, decided we wanted to stick with things that could be without question validated, and hopefully helping people to appreciate that reincarnation is something that is an actuality. It makes sense of 500 other things, obviously, about life and existence, that the relatively absolutist kind of approaches of heaven and hell and things of that nature really don't kind of satisfy. So but you can, find out more about those. Just want to touch on before as we wind up here, about reincarnation and the Rosicrucian kind of philosophy or teachings around reincarnation, right? We know it's a central tenet of the Rosicrucian philosophy, but members are in no way obligated in order to maintain their membership and be affiliated with Rosicrucian in order to accept reincarnation. It's up to each individual free to make their own mind up regarding its validity, and very much in keeping with the Rosicrucian approach to everything that's presented in Rosicrucian teachings, right? We're a walking question mark, kind of believe nothing and find out and test things to your own satisfaction, rather than simply on blind faith. What's interesting, the Rosicrucian viewpoint, though, regarding reincarnation is really reflected in the symbol of the Rosy Cross. So if we kind of look at that symbol, the cross representing earthly experience and the unfoldment of the soul personality through these successive earthly experiences, right? Basically, the rose unfolds, and we more greatly have the realization express the consciousness of the cosmic, which is a oneness by its nature, and which is immanent in all creation, even though to our objective senses it's not obvious to us. The Rosicrucian point of view is that to achieve this, to attain that particular state, which it takes many lifetimes, because I think most of us who have been at this for a while realize just even transforming ourselves in the ways that we can see are needed. And it's kind of like when you're climbing a mountain, every time you go to a hill, you see there's another hill in front of things that still need to be refined and worked on in oneself. But just to kind of do some basic cleaning up, even if you focus on it, you surely can use a whole lifetime doing that. So generally the view is that it takes multiple lifetimes, which reincarnation obviously fits with. So the soul eventually unfolds symbolically, right, as we make that progress. And we would say that when cosmic consciousness attain, the rose is in full bloom. And as Rosicrucians would say, one becomes a rose croix. If you pardon whatever I did for that French, CROIX. So it fits very much in. If you're looking for more information on the topic, lots of places you can find it. The University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies has a website, and they got plenty of their research all available. It's kind of free. You don't need to buy the publications, which is if you kind of just Google it, you may wind up behind these paywalls to get access to these research reports, but it's all downloadable off their website. There's a number of YouTube videos with James Matlock, who's another person who's a researcher in this area, obviously plenty with Jim Tucker. There's a Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, which is quite interesting also, and another topic for another discussion. There are several books. One is by Dr. Stevenson, which was Life Before Life, which recounts a lot of his research at that point. And there's also a very readable book, not kind of written for the scientific community, whereas very often Dr. Stevenson and others like Dr. Tucker have to write in a way that satisfies their kind of more traditional scientific peers in the university community, including UVA, right? So they're much more kind of narrow in how they present things in a way that would not draw conclusions. Even as you'll see with their work, they'll talk about evidence for reincarnation, but not say it's conclusive. Right, a case of the reincarnation type is typically how they refer to the case as a case of the reincarnation type, because the scientific community can be very aggressive and hostile to ideas that are outside of whatever the conventional wisdom is at a given point in time, and that's just true throughout science's modern history. There's a book called Old Souls by a guy named Tom Schroeder. He once spoke at a Rosicrucian convention that we had. It was a regional convention, and I think he's still working for the Washington Post, but he was at the time the features editor for the Washington Post, and he wrote a book basically looking at some of Dr. Stevenson's work and went on with him a few trips. And it's a quite fascinating book. A guy that starts off as like, hey, I don't really, not feeling this stuff too much, to like looking at some of it really kind of, and a little bit of synchronicity in it as well, which is enough to make one really to put the icing on the cherry on the cake, so to speak. And then say another one by Dr. Tucker. But also there's a good a YouTube channel by LMN, which is like Lifetime something, but one of their kind of playlists, which they've titled Ghost Inside My Child, has obviously a certain theatrical tone to the labeling there. But they've got maybe actually it's about 50 to 60 videos focused on the past life, generally in recall in children of past lives, and they kind of sometimes dramatically present it and so on. But the children and the case of the parents who were very ordinary everyday folks, they are compelling. So worthwhile doing that YouTube LMN channel there. So I just wanted to end with looking at what we have here again about the Rosy Cross and what it symbolizes for us as we think about reincarnation. Obviously, it symbolizes many, many things and many more, but just to reflect on a little bit before we close here. So everyone, peace profound, and so will it be.